Start.
Hi, Jordan from the quality team. I'm here with
Carmen, curriculum team leader for Sport and Public Services.
Excellent. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about TLA. So as you're all aware, we've introduced the new TLA roadmap and we've introduced the new TLA strategy. And once we deliver the TLA, what excellent TLA looks like, Carmen's been a shining light in regards to changing and adapting teaching, learning assessments within her areas to ensure that learners are getting the best possible experience. So I've asked Carmen to come and have a quick little chat with us about what she's been doing, what's the impact been, and the positive outcomes so far. So Carmen, when we did the excellent TLA strategy, can you just give us a bit of an overview of what you did straight after that TLA strategy?
So when we did the overview of the TLA strategy, it was kind of like roadmapped into allowing people to jump on at certain points, like through bronze, silver and gold, in terms of it weren't monitoring people being, if they were red light, they weren't really doing really good. It wasn't labelled like that. It was more from a developmental point of view. So in terms of roadmap, it was looking at where you were in terms of your quality and your standpoint in your teaching, and where did you fit on that roadmap in terms of what you're doing in your practice and what areas for development that you could work towards. So from doing the TLA strategy, it was more the way, what I took away from it was sometimes as tutors you can become quite in your old ways of doing certain things, not within sequence, but you don't come out of the old methods. You're kind of quite ritual in terms of what you do day to day. And when we did the TLA, some of the things that we did were quite interactive, and it, rather than the standpoint of you just doing a gaming lesson or a practical based element, it was what can we take away from that, and how did learning and assessments and quality assurance and all that stuff, how did that implement into that? So from the TLA session, there was one of the games that we did, and it was like a shuttlecock base, and it was testing, it was getting competitive, increasing motivation, engagement within the class, even from the TLA perspective, but also when I adapted it into my class, what I found where it was an engagement point for learners. So straight away, when the activity started, 100% everyone was fully engaged. Rather than standing at the front doing a typical delivery of some sessions like you might do, you might have 20% engaged, you might have 30% halfly engaged, you might have 50% fully engaged. Straight away, including them types of aspects and different types of inclusive methods, 100% every single one was engaged. And straight away, they knew what they were doing because they've got that competitive element and the motivation was high. They was encouraged to do what they needed to do. You kind of got learners took more from it, and it was more in terms of the aspect they got a lot from that session, from what I was asking them to get in terms of did they answer the questions, did they get the questions, and how did they utilise them questions then when utilising the assessment. And it just brings it back to, I remember that session, it was interactive, it was engaging. I actually remember that answer, so I can now embed it into my assessment. So through the TLA strategy, it actually took me out of my old methods and took me into thinking about how can I make things, especially for my area, for sport and public services, they're quite competitive. They really want that competitive edge, and they want to be engaged in something that's quite, rather than sit down doing some learning, it might be a word sheet or a task sheet. They want something that's quite motivating to motivate them more. So it worked really well.
Good, great stuff. And I know you'd taken part in the excellent TLA session, and you'd amended and adapted that task that we did in order to, as you've just said there, to incorporate for the sports and public service learners. Was there anything in particular that stood out for you in relation to the learners' engagement and participation?
So straight away with sport and public service learners, obviously through adapting that type of teaching method and that activity, straight away what I found from the learners' engagement is there was almost 100% fully engaged in the session, and they knew exactly what they were doing. So from start to finish, sometimes when you set a task in lesson, you might get 40% complete that task in that time frame. You might get 50% that might complete half of that task or 3/4 of that task, and you might get some learners that might not 100% complete that task in that time frame. But from the activity that I asked them to do, every single one of them got a full completion in terms of the task I wanted them to complete. But that was down to how engaging the session was and how motivated they was to get it, because there was a competitive edge for them. So they wanted to win. And by doing that, they had to complete all the tasks in order to do it in a time frame. So by adapting that method, what learners didn't realise is that they was actually learning alongside, but they was taking into account everything that they was learning, because they was trying to reach every single point of that activity in order to get the knowledge, skills that I wanted them to take away. So without realising that, they got more from that session, rather than just doing a session where you might do incorporating a different task, some written tasks, some formative tasks. by doing that, they got a lot more from it. So when we come to do the practical assessments now, everything that they went through in that session, what they will find is they can remember that knowledge because it's actually quite stimulating. It's still in the brain. They can remember it from the previous session. It's not just lesson 4. Can you remember when we looked at that? No, I remember that because I remember what happened in that session, and that's what they'll take away from it as well.
Excellent. So from an inclusion standpoint, how did you ensure that the session was inclusive to take part in that practical activity?
So obviously, as per the class that I have, obviously we know about the certain types of needs. We've got some learners in there that are autistic. We've got some learners in there that have a lot of sensory issues. So it's time to use it, obviously, as an educator to control that in terms of what ways you do that. So like for the sensory issues, it was getting quite competitive. People were quite talking loudly. The room was quite overstimulating at times, but obviously because that person who had them oversensory needs, because they was quite fixated and quite competitive anyway, it took them out of that need. It took them out of that will where they was actually focused on the sounds, because that competitive and motivation level was driving that. But then when it came to a time where it might have been too loud, it was asking learners to obviously dim that down. Obviously, let's be quiet. Let's focus on more on the task, even though it might just be a little bit loud shouting or like talking loudly between the groups. It was just obviously making sure that was in control. Other things that we've got learners that had that dyslexia. So obviously white paper, obviously black and white paper. In terms of the assessments that they had, they making sure that they had the overlays there, which are on hand. Sometimes personal responsibility, but obviously the staff make sure that they have on hand so that they can utilise it. But there was also methods if they forgot their overlays or there wasn't blue paper, we could use computers so they can put the learning materials were already on Classroom, so they could change backgrounds, could change fonts, so they could actually not take as much time, because obviously the dyslexia sometimes slow processing in terms of reading some of the materials. They could change it and adapt it at that time so they could actually be at the same speed as everybody else. So in terms of making it inclusive, there was a lot of ways in that session that from a personal perspective as an educator that you can control, but also what you do with your materials and giving the learner responsibility on how they can actually change what they're doing in order to make sure that they're not missing out on anything.
Brilliant. And then you'd mentioned you'd done another activity, yes, to do with your learners. Do you want to explain
Yeah,
that?
so we're doing a unit called Global Affairs, and Global Affairs is a unit on Level 3 BTEC Uniform Tech Services, and it's looking at global affairs that happen nationally, and it can be from a uniform sector services perspective, but it can be also looking into non-uniform tech services perspective as well. So in terms of the game that we did yesterday, we did a Cards Against Humanity game, and we were looking at some moral dilemmas, because we know in the world at the minute there's so much conflict happening, and that can be from a educational, healthcare sector, from a Ministry of Defence. There's loads of like moral dilemmas that we make as part of our day-to-day life, and what is the right way might not be the right way for somebody else. And you're faced with that quite a lot in uniform protected services. Is it worth saving this old man at 89 years of age, or is it worth saving 5 younger people who have got longer to live? It's that quality of what judgment do you make? So we're doing a lot of moral dilemmas work, and we use a Cards Against Humanity game where obviously there was 7 scenarios in the middle of the table, and they was all working in pairs. And these pairs were based up differently based on the levels that they were working against. So we've got like people who are on pass criteria. They were working essentially with people on merits. And we've got people who are working with distinctions, working with individuals on like a merit grade. Just because when they are having these conversations, it's hoping that those who are working towards higher targets or at that level might provide more information out those working at pass criteria level at the minute. And obviously it gives them more of a better understanding of who they're working with, and it can challenge them a lot more in terms of their thinking and processes, how they do it. So in terms of the game itself, what they had to do were, one person was nominated each time on the wheel to come up and read a scenario to the class, and that also incorporates English and maths in terms of reading out to the class the scenario base that they all had to make a decision. And then they had 7 red cards, 7 blue cards. The blue cards were 4, and there were answers like why they think that case study should be quite a positive influence. The red cards were negative, and they were kind of against what it were. So, for example, one of the questions were, should a doctor be supportive in assisted suicide for an individual who is terminally ill? The red cards are like, no, doctors save lives, not end lives. One of the questions were, is everybody has a human right? Everybody has a decent human right to live? So it was looking at that challenging process. What do they think? Is it, no, we think doctors should save lives, not kill people? Or is it the fact that we should actually, morally and human rights, that is a given legislation in the UK, do we offer that first? And it's challenging that learners thinking in terms of why they have that thought. And it's giving learners the autonomy to make their own decisions at the same time, because what you found were they had the conflict of opinions, and it also got learners being more stretch and challenge in terms of why should I think about that, or should I rather be tunnel visions? Why do I need to take into these wider considerations? At the same time, that linked to the criteria when they're looking at the analysis, when they're looking at the evaluation. So actually, in part of the interactive activity, what they didn't realise is they were actually looking at the assessment and actually broadening them answers out by having this engagement with each other. So that when the session finished, when we come down to a plenary session and we started looking at the assignment and looking at the assessment criteria, when they're looking at the evaluation and analysis, oh, I can actually talk about that argument, because when we had that argument about this certain case study, that was that forward they put forward. So that's a negative, where my point was a positive. Your evaluation has already been drawn through by that activity. So it helped then in terms of plenary and structure of assessments, because they've gained that insight from obviously an activity in the session.
Brilliant, thank you. So with the new TLA strategy, and you've given some really good examples of how you're incorporating the new roadmap and the new strategy to develop teaching and learning. Is there anything that you've identified from reflecting back on that what you want to change, what you want to develop, what you want to spend time on continuous professional development?
Yeah, so one of the things that obviously mine would be is sequencing of sessions. One thing I would take away from it, just because, again, as educators, you can become quite fixated in following specifications in terms of what you need to do, obviously what you need to entail. And sometimes with the sequence of the sessions, you're quite fixated on following that to meet the assessment methods. And I think sometimes when you're doing your sequence in your sessions, it's quite interesting to develop some things outside of that specification that is more increasing learners' wider knowledge. And that could also link to like your educators, your CPD. So for example, in coaching, they have to look at the roles and responsibilities that they have as a coach and what they need to do, and looking at recent change in legislation. But by doing that sequence in that session, linking that, it actually made me go away and think, I need to have more focus on like going out back into industry and doing more CPD around my industry in terms of what is changing, because every year we know that awarding bodies and governing bodies change the way that we operate. And that might be in terms of safeguarding and reporting. It might be the fact of what do we value more in terms of our players and athletes development. So it actually, through some of the sequence of the sessions that I've done, it's actually encouraged me more to think, I want to go back out in industry and do some more CPD around that, because by doing that, that's going to allow me and better my sequencing in my sessions, because it's going to allow me to draw more knowledge in that is relevant at this time, rather than like a specification of what they ask them to do. And that's going to prepare them more when it goes out into industry. They've got that more recent subject knowledge by me not just focusing on what sequencing and what the assessment and what the awarding body wants. Aside that as well, going out into industry and looking at more informed practice and what's more recent and up to date.
Brilliant, thank you for that. So Carmen, thank you for your time, really appreciate that. Hopefully that'll give other individuals to have a think about and reflect on aspects of what you can take from what Carmen's been doing and incorporate that into your own sessions. So thank you.